A 70-year-old woman vanishes without a trace.
It had been about a month since anybody had talked to her.
I even left her some messages. Can you please just call and let us know you're okay?
Her former caretaker tells police she went on a trip with friends.
She was coming back with some friends. Don't know who the people are.
Bank records showed that her card had been used at 2 different gas stations.
But a search of her home reveals the horrifying truth.
The detective went in the house. He said it reeked of incense. There were just a ton of flies.
What I see is a big mound of concrete and what looks like a human shoulder, hair.
It just absolutely broke my heart when I heard what had happened to her.
And the evidence points to a killer no one expected.
She's smart. She thought, hey, I'm going to have time to get my story straight.
Did you not kill her? Look at me. Look at me and be honest with me.
I am being honest.
You killed her, didn't you?
July 29th, 2021. It's a late summer day in rural North Carolina when Detective Tim Austin gets an unusual emergency call.
A call came into my desk that had been transferred from the communications center. Janelle Sparks is the sister-in-law of Lynn Sparks Keene, who lived in Linville Falls. She informed me that Lynn was 70 years old, had suffered from a traumatic brain injury in the past, and it had been about a month since anybody had talked to her, and she wanted somebody to go check on her.
According to Janelle, Lynn has disappeared before, but never for this long.
And the explanation from Janelle was that Lynn, she was an alcoholic in the past. She would go sometimes for a few weeks that nobody could get in touch with her. She was just that type of person. She did have a person living in her home that was helping take care of her.
Elizabeth Carserino was the live-in caretaker of Lynn Keene.
Janelle and her husband live in South Carolina, and the rest of the family lives in Florida. So it's been a blessing to have someone taking care of Lynn. But over a month ago, Elizabeth told them Lynn had unexpectedly left town.
According to Elizabeth, some friends had drove up from Louisiana, and they had partied, gotten drunk at the home, and the next morning Lynn decided that she wanted to go to Louisiana with her friends. My biggest fear was that if she had suffered from a traumatic brain injury in the past, and she's out here driving, she's consuming alcohol, she's with people, could they possibly do something to her? Could she lose control because of her age and her health concerns? We have to get everything out there that we can to try to find her. Every description of what she could be driving, who she could be with, what clothing she was wearing. So I started learning more about Lynn from her family. Time is our enemy, and we've got to work as fast as we can to try to locate her in a timely manner for her safety.
Lynn Sparks was born June 17, 1951, in Pinellas County, Florida. She and her older brother Butch were raised by a single mother.
Her mom, Wanda, was divorced from her dad, Jack. Lynn and Wanda were very, very close, almost more like sisters than mother and daughter. Lynn had a very adventurous personality. We both belonged to the swim club, so we would go and swim and carry on with all our friends.
In her early 20s, Lynn moved to the Florida Keys and worked as a bartender. There, she met Russell Keene, a businessman and father of 3.
Russell Keene was a very eccentric man. At the time that Lynn met my father-in-law, he was already in the process of going through a brutal divorce. He had all these wild and crazy ideas and aspirations, and a lot of them he put to fruition. He owned several Pizza Huts, a couple radio stations. He had a hotel down in the Turks and Caicos.
Russell was a bit older than Lynn was. She was truly in love with him.
By the time Russell's divorce was finalized, he'd lost most of his assets. So he and Lynn moved to North Carolina, where they lived in a home owned by Russell's father.
He never went back to work. He was too distraught. He felt like a failure and couldn't get past it. Lynn was the one that went waitressing at Louise's in order to make money for them to live off of. She was a trooper, but they were a pretty good, loving family, like any family with hardships.
Lynn got along well with Russell's adult children, especially his son Russ and his wife Kristen.
I remember the first time I went up to meet Lynn and Russell. It was such a warm welcome. It really was. I mean, Lynn was just such a sweet person and really kind of took me in. You know, she never had children. She kind of looked at Russ and I like her children.
But in 2001, Kristen's husband Russ was killed in the September 11th terrorist attacks.
Kind of was in a daze. And that's when mine and Lynn's relationship really started to grow. She was a sounding board for me. We all cried together a lot. It brought us closer. She was so close to my daughter. They both shared the love of reading, and they would go to the bookstore together. She's the one who got Masley her first library card. They had a very close relationship.
In 2016, the family was struck by more tragedy when Lynn's husband Russell passed away and her mother's health began to fail.
Lynn was, kind of helping her out around the house, although I think it got to be a little too much for her, and that's how Elizabeth came in the picture.
Elizabeth lived across the street, and they said she was, very good to Wanda, taking care of Wanda.
Lynn was like, Wanda needs more support. I can't really lift her. And Elizabeth was a strong person, so it seemed to be a good fit.
4 years later, in 2020, Wanda passed away when Lynn was 69 years old, which is when her problems with alcohol seemed to begin.
Lynn was having a really rough time. When Wanda passed, it was really hard for her. She's lost her husband, now she's lost her mother. It was tough.
When Lynn visited Kristen and her daughter in Florida that November, it became clear how bad things had gotten.
Something wakes me up at 4:45 in the morning, and I'm hearing music out on the pool deck, and I'm like, what is going on? So I open up the door, and it's Lynn, and she's having fun. She starts walking up the stairs of the pool deck to try to come talk to me. Well, she loses her balance, and she falls. She fell over the planter, smacked her head on the pool deck, bleeding, and she's unconscious. I'm talking to 911, I'm trying to compress on her head, and they come get her. Doctor says, look, you had a brain bleed. She needed to be on supervision because she could get dizzy. She had a concussion.
When Lynn returned to North Carolina, Elizabeth Carserino moved into the house to care for her full-time in exchange for room and board.
Elizabeth understood the situation. Lynn was buying all the food, provided a house over her head. The next 6 months, Lynn was healing. She'd go to bed at like 4 o'clock in the afternoon, try to sleep through what would be her drinking time. So she wouldn't do that anymore. And she got clean. When she got the all clear, I had been looking at river cruises. Go see new things and enjoy your life, live a little. Lynn was excited.
But now, it's been over 1 month since Kristen has heard from her mother-in-law, Lynn Keene, and North Carolina police are on their way to the house to check on her.
myself and 3 other detectives, we loaded up in 2 different cars and rode out to Linville Falls. Janelle, Lynn's sister-in-law, had told me that there shouldn't be anybody at the home. Elizabeth had already informed them that Lynn told her to move out. I went up there, knocked and announced several times, found that the door knob, it was locked. The curtains were closed. I was told that there was a Lincoln Town car that Lynn drives, and it was not in the driveway. There was some building materials for the wheelchair ramp that was under construction. Wood and some bags of what is called concrete mix. Nothing appeared like there had been a breaking and entering or any kind of violent crime. This looked like a home that somebody was actively living in, that they just weren't home at that time. And I saw no reason to go inside the house. Because of her health issues and the fact that the family hasn't heard from her, I went back to the office and have her entered as a missing endangered person.
Detective Austin also reaches out to Lynn's caretaker, Elizabeth Carserino.
I called at least 2 times trying to get in touch with Elizabeth and only got voicemail. I left my name and number and information that I needed to talk to her. She may be the last person to see Lynn. I also have 2 unknown friends, a Karen and an unknown male, and Lynn took off to Louisiana, so I'm beginning to get worried. Could something have happened to them?
Coming up, the search for Lynn Keene raises new concerns.
We were all upset with Lynn, disappointed in the fact that she fell off the wagon.
And detectives find answers buried in the dark.
I'm following my nose, and the smell of something decomposing is getting stronger the further I go.
Are you saying I did this?
I'm saying you know about it.
"70-year-old Lynn Keene hasn't been heard from in over a month, and North Carolina police are unable to reach her caretaker, Elizabeth Carserino. Detectives call Lynn's daughter-in-law, Kristen Keene, to ask if she's heard from Elizabeth. She tells them Elizabeth moved out after Lynn left town.
Elizabeth Carserino had been in contact for probably a month with Kristen Keene, but Elizabeth had not contacted law enforcement. She tells Kristen, hey, I'm not at the house anymore. I'm camping with my son up in Maggie Valley.
Elizabeth said, I'll try to reach back out when I have signal, but I'm not going to be always available. Elizabeth told me some of Lynn's barfly friends from Louisiana had popped in. They brought in alcohol, and Elizabeth said, well, I tried to tell her Lynn's not drinking anymore, and she wouldn't listen to me, and she said, I just went to bed. She goes, but the next morning when I woke up, Lynn asked me to go to the pharmacy for her and get some things. And I said, why? And she said, because I'm going to Louisiana.
She didn't know who these people were. It kind of heightened how she was feeling about it.
We were all upset with Lynn, disappointed in the fact that she fell off the wagon, and she had done so well. I even left her some messages like, Lynn, honey, I really need to talk to you to make sure you're okay. At that stage in her life, it was a lot for her to take off and just go somewhere. And we're like, what in the world is going on? None of this makes sense.
Due to the fact that Lynn mentioned traveling to Louisiana, detectives put out a bolo for her vehicle along the route from North Carolina.
On August 2nd, I was notified by the Cherokee Police Department that the car was found in Cherokee, North Carolina. They had that vehicle towed to their secure lot. They found the keys to the vehicle under the driver's seat. There was nobody in the vehicle. Nothing stood out to them other than there was a Wells Fargo bank card in the car that was in the name of Lynn Keene. There was a Social Security card as well underneath the driver's seat. That Social Security card belonging to Lynn Keene. Bank records showed that her card had been used in Marion, North Carolina, and had been used in Cherokee, North Carolina, both times to fill up for gas at 2 different gas stations. It is starting to worry me because most people would not just leave their bank card, their Social Security card, as well as their car keys all locked up inside their vehicle.
Further analysis of the traffic recordings reveals another clue.
The Cherokee Tribal Police were able to find video of Lynn's car coming through town, and it appeared to be just occupied by one person, but the video was very grainy and couldn't make it out exactly who it was. The person driving the vehicle didn't look like Lynn. They looked like a bigger body type. What's going on in my mind is, if Lynn's not there, where did she go? Where did the people go that were with Lynn?
Police had not conducted a search of Lynn's house during their initial wellness check, but now they believe there is cause to do so.
Based on this, I did apply for a search warrant. In the interim, I've received a call from Kristen that she actually had a friend go into the home.
I had a friend that was a former detective in Tennessee. I called them up. I said, find a way in. I don't care. He went in the house. He said it reeked of incense. There was, a couple items that looked like somebody had just been there. And he goes, when I went down into the basement, there were just a ton of flies. When he said flies, I just felt so sick to my stomach.
Four days after Lynn Keene was reported missing, her daughter-in-law, Kristen Keene, is informing investigators about the new concerning details in Lynn's home. But the call is interrupted by Lynn's caretaker.
Kristen told me she was getting a call waiting from Elizabeth. So I said, take the call me back, let me know what she says. Shortly after that, Kristen calls me back and tells me that Elizabeth is very angry with her.
She got really angry at me because she felt I was accusing her of doing something to Lynn. I told her, Elizabeth, I said, not for nothing. You are the last person to see Lynn alive as we know it, because nobody's seen her since. You're going to be the first person that the police want to talk to.
Kristen says that it's just very unlike Elizabeth the way she was acting. She was acting guilty of something. What's going on in my head is I need to find Elizabeth. I need to speak with her because her story of what she has told the family is not adding up.
As their calls to Elizabeth Carserino continue to go unanswered, detectives return to Lynn's home with a search warrant.
There was nothing visual to the naked eye. I mean, everything appeared to be very tidy. There was no indicators that any kind of struggle or anything had taken place in that house.
I checked the main floor of the home, and then I see a doorway that I don't know where it goes. Well, I open this door, and immediately I'm hit with a very strong odor of something dead. There's also very large flies. And so I start making my way down the stairs of this home. Flies are everywhere. And the smell of something decomposing is getting stronger the further I go. I walk into this back room, and off in the corner I see a pile of something covered with a tarp and a box sitting on top of it. I remove the box, set it off the side, and I pull the tarp back. What I see is something, it looks like a big mound of concrete. and sitting on top of it is a bag of pre-mixed concrete mix. And the smell is just overwhelming. And I can see mixed on the edges of the concrete what looks like a human shoulder, hair. I've got a crime scene. I don't know who's in the concrete. I think it's Lynn. I immediately call for assistance from other investigators. I request the assistance of the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, and I start taping off the area.
The North Carolina Bureau of Investigation sends Special Agent Maggie Holder to the crime scene. Her first challenge is how to remove the body for identification.
I was a little intimidated trying to figure out, what's the best way to do this and preserve the body to make sure that we can send the body to autopsy.
They start chiseling away at the concrete. They proved it was a human being. Could not see a face. I could see parts of arms. I could see the thighs, parts of the calf. Very decomposed. Around the neck, I can see a belt that is tight, as in this person's been strangled.
While it's clear a murder has been committed, there is little else in the home to explain how or when it happened.
Initially, on the first crime scene search, it was not apparent that there was any blood or anything.
After investigators leave the scene, they call Lynn's loved ones. They are devastated when they learn of the discovery.
I kind of had already tried to prepare myself for the worst. I was sitting on the couch with my daughter in the living room, and Tim Austin called. He said, "Kristen, I'm certain that's her in the basement. Of course, we have to do autopsy and everything, but based on her hair, it's her."
Lynn and I were so close that it just absolutely broke my heart when I heard what had happened to her.
My daughter and I just start crying. We just start sobbing. Just like, you don't ever want that to be true.
And their suspicion of Elizabeth Carserino continues to grow.
Elizabeth Carserino avoided contacting law enforcement. It clearly showed that she was trying to avoid us.
The day after finding the body, Detective Austin uncovers more incriminating evidence.
I was able to find in Marion, North Carolina, that the store where the gas was purchased did have video.
When he reviews the footage from July 29th, a month after Lynn was last seen, he spots a familiar face.
It was not Lynn. In the video, Elizabeth is coming to the store, driving Lynn's car, pulling into the gas pumps, using a card to get gas. And in my head, I'm putting it together that Elizabeth's supposed to be in Maggie Valley. All of Lynn's stuff is found in Cherokee, and we're talking about two areas that are less than 30 minutes apart. I've got Elizabeth driving Lynn's car, and I've got Elizabeth using Lynn's bank card. We had nothing saying that Lynn ever gave her permission to use this. So I went before a magistrate who issued a warrant for Elizabeth Carserino's arrest. It started going through my mind of how could Lynn have been taken to the basement? Could one person have carried her, or is there somebody else involved? I needed those questions answered.
From there, I began working on a phone order in order to get up on Elizabeth Carserino's cell phone to see where she was in real time. And so at that point, I knew we had to find Elizabeth fast.
North Carolina investigators have collected evidence suggesting Elizabeth Carserino murdered her former patient, Lynn Keene. While the search for Elizabeth continues, detectives take a closer look at her background.
Elizabeth Catherine Carserino, born August 6, 1968. Her parents were Mary and Carl Smith, and she did have a brother named Johnny. She was raised in Goose Creek, South Carolina, just outside Charleston.
We did find out that she had spent some time in Utahville, South Carolina. She did have 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, and one of her sons she had just reconnected with and was trying to forge a relationship. The other son was incarcerated, and the daughter did not have anything to do with her. Elizabeth Carserino had no type of medical training. She was basically just a layman caretaker.
I think that her friendship with Wanda was kind, and so she wanted to help and just said she could be the caretaker. Elizabeth was kind enough, but she was definitely a very direct person. She seemed a little nervous around me.
The only times that in her criminal history that she had any type of trouble was writing bad checks. She had been charged with several.
Nothing in Elizabeth's record indicates she would be capable of committing such a gruesome crime. So investigators focus on tracking her down for questioning.
She said that she was traveling with her son and camping in Maggie Valley with him. And we needed to make sure that Elizabeth's son had nothing to do with Lynn going missing. And we were able to determine that he lives in Georgia.
When agents with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation interview Elizabeth's son, he claims to know nothing about Lynn's murder.
We got up on the phone line. His phone never left the state of Georgia, and he was also very cooperative throughout the investigation.
Detectives conclude Elizabeth's son had nothing to do with Lynn's murder and rule him out as a potential suspect. He informs detectives he last saw his mother less than a year ago.
It was determined that he really didn't have a lot to do with her.
On August 5th, 2 days after the body was removed from Lynn Keene's house, the medical examiner conducts an autopsy.
Dental records were provided which belonged to Lynn Keene and were matched to the body to confirm that that was in fact Lynn.
According to the pathologist, the preliminary cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head and ligature strangulation, and it would be in that order. She was struck with some object in the head, causing a big head injury, but did not kill her. Ligature strangulation came second, and that is what killed her.
Investigators now have a positive identification, cause of death, and a prime suspect, but they are no closer to bringing her in.
We were able to find a couple of photographs of Elizabeth. We put this out that she was wanted.
On August 6th, they discover why Elizabeth has been so difficult to track down.
There was a nurse at a hospital that actually saw the picture of Elizabeth and recognized her as a patient of hers that was currently in the hospital.
Detectives are informed that Elizabeth was admitted 2 days earlier on August 4th.
It was relayed to me through Cherokee Tribal Police that she was in a campground staying in a tent in Cherokee, North Carolina, which was actually only a few hundred yards from where the car was abandoned.
She had left the vehicle and walked on foot to a campground and had been camping in a tent. She took some Tylenol PM and slit her wrist trying to take her own life. To me, that is showing that she's feeling very guilty for something, but definitely something traumatic has happened.
Local law enforcement in Silva were able to arrest Elizabeth at the medical facility where she was transferred from their custody to the Avery County Sheriff's Office.
Your first thought is, okay, I've got to get this person to talk to me. This was just such an egregious way to murder someone, and I just wanted to know what happened.
Coming up, police confront Elizabeth about what exactly happened to Lynn Keene.
What did she do to you to get you over that breaking?
I don't know what to say to you.
She tried to use the old amnesia thing. I think she was distancing herself from the crime.
And Lynn's loved ones seek justice for her terrifying murder.
And we're both trying to play back this whole thing in our head. Like, how could we have missed that?
On August 7th, 4 days after the body of Lynn Keene was found in her basement, investigators questioned the suspected killer, Elizabeth Carserino.
My goal at the time was to establish a rapport to get her to open up to talk to us. And then to be able to use those facts that she gives me to establish a motive.
When was the last time you talked with Miss Lynn?
The last time I spoke to her, she was supposedly in Louisiana. She was coming back with some friends. Don't know who the people are. Only know what the one girl's first name is.
Well, I got some information I want to share with you.
Okay.
Lynn is dead.
Don't tell me that.
Oh, yeah.
And whenever he tells her that, she puts her hands over her face and just, acts really surprised and starts sort of crying.
While Elizabeth appears saddened by the news of Lynn's death, she says caring for the woman had been a challenge.
I was constantly cleaning up everything. Of course, she didn't remember that because she was drunk. She yelled at me and told me that she might as well pay somebody to clean the house because I don't do a damn thing but sit on my ass. And that pissed me off to no end because I did absolutely everything. I went and bought all the groceries. I put everything up. I did all the cooking. I did all the cleaning. I did all the laundry. I even put her clothes up for her.
And nothing was never good enough.
When she got to that point, no, it wasn't.
What did she do to you to get you over that breaking?
Are you saying I did this?
I'm saying you know about it.
I don't know what to say to you if I can't remember right this moment. I don't know what to say.
You want to go take a walk?
Sure.
After a break for Elizabeth to regain her composure, investigators try questioning her again.
We know you're human. We're human. We make mistakes. But we do have a job to do.
I do understand that.
You did this. You killed Lynn and you left her in that house.
And it went back and forth that she just couldn't remember the details and what had happened. So then there come a point in time within the interview that I kind of changed my role and got more aggressive with her.
You got tired of her and you killed her. Did you not kill her? Look at me. Look at me and be honest with me.
I am being honest.
You killed her, didn't you?
Yes, I killed her. I can't get it out of my head.
That's right.
I can't get it out what I did.
Elizabeth refuses to go into detail, but her actions after leaving Lynn's house show investigators she went to great lengths attempting to cover it up.
Elizabeth is smart. and knew to call Kristen multiple times and put her on a different trail, like Karen in Louisiana going down with friends. She knew to bring up that she went to Maggie Valley with her son. She thought, hey, I'm going to have time to get my story straight.
As for motive, they believe the growing tension between the two women finally became too much for Elizabeth to take.
According to Elizabeth Carserino, Lynn was very restricted about where she could go, what she could do, that it was pretty much she had to be 24/7 with Lynn. And I believe that over a period of time that anger and resentment and rage built up, and I think that maybe on this particular day, I think that Elizabeth lost her temper.
She snaps on her and hits her over the head. Instead of calling 911 of, oh God, I've messed up, I've hurt her, let's get her some help. She put a belt around her neck and took her life. I spoke with the district attorney, and he felt it appropriate to go ahead and have a warrant issued for Elizabeth for the crime of murder.
So you've got them in custody. So there is some highs, there is still some lows, because you still got a lot of work to do. This case has got to be presented in a court of law, and you're trying to make sure everything is tied up to where that this is going to be a winnable case.
After a week of investigation, Elizabeth Carserino is arrested and charged with the murder of 70-year-old Lynn Keene.
They called us right away, and it was like, we got her. We got her. I'm crying like a baby, and Lynn's brother, just devastated. First he lost his mom, and now his sister, so horribly, and Janelle too, and we're both trying to play back this whole thing in our head, like, how could we have missed that?
Like investigators, Lynn's loved ones are frustrated by Elizabeth's refusal to explain the whole truth.
She claims to have had amnesia, can't remember anything. BS. I call BS. She's lying.
The family's resentment is intensified by the amount of time it takes to bring Elizabeth to justice.
Elizabeth's attorney died, and so we had to wait. It took 2.5 years to even get to trial.
In January 2024, the long-awaited day finally comes.
I was there for that day. I was sitting in the front row, and in walks Elizabeth right through the door. She looks at me and then quickly looks away. Looks could kill.
I was told she had an option, plead guilty. It would be easier, and she might get less time.
Rather than go to trial, Elizabeth decides to plead guilty. At her sentencing hearing, prosecutors present new evidence for the court to take into consideration.
The crime scene agent who initially processed the scene on August 3rd, he returned and performed something called Blue Star. Blue Star is like luminol, basically a liquid chemical mixture that we use to look for blood that has either been cleaned up or there's small amounts of blood that can't be seen with the naked eye. Sprayed it within the master bedroom area, and it fluoresced quite a bit on the floor, on the bed, and in different areas within the residence. And that indicated to us that that is in fact probably where the initial assault occurred, and then likely murder there.
Prosecutors believe Elizabeth used the belt to drag Lynn down to the basement. where she used the bags of concrete to attempt to hide the body.
She's telling the family these stories that some friends and Lynn took off to Louisiana, and Elizabeth packs everything she can. She goes to the store and buys several things using Lynn's bank card, and she goes on the run.
To kill this woman that you had taken care of, and for the next month, lie to her family while her body is decomposing in the basement. It's pretty sick.
Lynn's loved ones add personal statements requesting Elizabeth receive the maximum sentence under the law.
My impact statement was mostly to let everybody know who Lynn was and how wonderful she was. None of us are perfect, but her heart and her soul, she was a wonderful person. She was caring, she was giving, she was kind. I wanted them to know about her. And the last part of my impact statement was directed mostly towards Elizabeth, and that she was lying, how evil she was. How could you live in a house where you murdered someone and they're rotting downstairs in the basement below you for almost 2 months? It's insane to me.
On January the 5th, 2024, Elizabeth Carserino was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole.
I'm a spiritual person. Like, I talk to Lynn every day. There is not a day that goes by that I don't think about her. Kind of like my husband, you know. I might not see them, but they're still here with me in spirit. Lynn was just a fun-loving, free spirit. She was kind. She was generous. I mean, in this day and age, when a lot of people have forgotten what kindness is, I mean, yeah, it's a loss. She never met a stranger.
No one remembers the exact moment a quiet town stops feeling safe. It happens slowly. A door left unlocked becomes a deadbolt. Children who once rode their bikes until sunset are called home before dinner. Strangers become suspicious. Familiar faces suddenly seem capable of impossible things. In Minnesota, the winter of 2000 left behind more than frozen lakes and empty roads. It left behind a question that refused to die. For years, people whispered about it in grocery store aisles, at church gatherings, and inside diners where coffee cups stayed warm longer than conversations. They lowered their voices whenever the subject appeared. Not because they were afraid of ghosts. They were afraid the person responsible had never truly left. It began on a bitterly cold evening. The kind of cold that swallows sound. Snow had fallen throughout the afternoon, covering every driveway, every sidewalk, every field with a fresh white blanket that reflected the pale glow of streetlights. The town looked untouched, peaceful, beautiful, but beneath that perfect layer of snow, something had already gone terribly wrong. A woman failed to come home. At first, nobody panicked. Friends assumed she had stayed late with coworkers. Family believed the weather had delayed her drive. A phone call went unanswered. Then another. By midnight, concern had replaced patience. Her car was found the following morning, parked only a few miles from home. The engine was cold. The driver's door was locked. Her purse remained inside. So did her wallet, her keys, even her winter coat. There were no signs of a struggle. No broken windows. No blood. Nothing that suggested violence. It looked as though she had simply stepped away for a moment. She never came back. Within hours, local deputies transformed quiet roads into crime scenes. Volunteers gathered before sunrise, walking shoulder to shoulder across frozen fields. Search dogs tracked faint scents that vanished beneath fresh snowfall. Helicopters scanned forests that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Nothing. Not a footprint. Not a discarded glove. Not a single clue pointing investigators in the right direction. The disappearance dominated local headlines. Every television station repeated the same photograph. A smiling face, bright eyes, someone who looked like the last person in the world who could simply disappear. The community responded immediately. Church groups organized searches. Farmers opened their land. Neighbors checked abandoned barns and empty cabins. Teenagers skipped school to join search parties. Retired couples prepared meals for volunteers. The entire county seemed determined to bring her home. Days turned into weeks. Weeks became months. Hope slowly transformed into exhaustion. Then investigators made a discovery. Not the victim, a witness. A truck driver reported seeing a dark-colored pickup parked near the roadside around the estimated time of the disappearance. Its headlights were off. Its engine appeared to be running. He remembered it only because it seemed strangely out of place during a snowstorm. Police appealed to the public. Did anyone know who owned the truck? Had anyone noticed unfamiliar vehicles? Phone lines flooded with tips. Hundreds arrived. Most led nowhere. One caller insisted the truck belonged to a local mechanic. Another believed it belonged to an out-of-state hunter. Someone else claimed it had government plates. Each theory collapsed under scrutiny. The truck became another mystery, another shadow without a name. Meanwhile, investigators reconstructed the victim's final known movements. She had left work on schedule, stopped briefly at a convenience store, purchased ordinary items, milk, bread, a newspaper. The cashier later described her as calm, friendly, completely unaware that she was living the final documented moments of her normal life. Security cameras were rare in 2000. The grainy footage available revealed almost nothing. A blurred figure, a parking lot, snow blowing across the lens. Technology could not answer the questions detectives desperately wanted answered. The investigation expanded. State investigators joined local authorities. Dozens of interviews became hundreds. Co-workers, neighbors, former classmates, family friends. Everyone was asked the same difficult questions. Had she seemed worried? Was anyone following her? Had she mentioned meeting someone? No one remembered anything unusual. She had plans for the future, bills waiting to be paid, appointments scheduled weeks ahead. A birthday celebration circled on the family calendar. Nothing suggested she intended to disappear. As winter faded into spring, frustration settled over the investigation like another season. Rumors filled the empty spaces left by evidence. Some believed she had run away. Others whispered about a secret relationship. A few insisted organized criminals were somehow involved. Each rumor spread quickly. Each one hurt someone. Friends became suspects. Neighbors questioned neighbors. Simple coincidences suddenly looked sinister. A man seen driving slowly through town found himself answering uncomfortable questions from strangers. A co-worker who had once argued with the victim discovered anonymous notes left in his mailbox. Fear changes communities. Not all at once. One conversation at a time. Detectives refused to surrender. They searched rivers after the ice melted. Divers entered freezing water despite almost non-existent visibility. Cadaver dogs searched miles of woodland. Ground-penetrating equipment examined remote properties. Nothing. Every search ended with more silence. Then came another strange detail. Someone reported receiving an anonymous phone call only days after the disappearance. The caller said just one sentence. "They're never coming back." The voice was described as calm. Neither young nor old. Neither angry nor emotional. Just certain. Investigators traced the call. No success. Public payphones still existed in those years. The trail ended almost before it began. That single sentence haunted detectives. Not because it proved anything, because it sounded like certainty. And certainty usually belongs to someone who knows more than everyone else. Years passed. Boxes filled with reports stacked higher inside evidence rooms. Maps covered with colored pins faded under fluorescent lights. New detectives inherited old files. Each promised a fresh perspective. Each believed they might notice what everyone else had missed. The answers never came. Families learned to celebrate holidays with an empty chair. Birthdays became reminders instead of celebrations. Photographs stopped aging even as everyone else grew older. Children became adults. Parents became grandparents. Some witnesses died before ever seeing justice. The file officially became what investigators dread most. A cold case. The phrase sounds clinical, almost harmless, but behind those two words lives a devastating truth. A family still waits. A community still wonders. A person responsible may still be walking freely. Time, however, has a strange relationship with the truth. Evidence forgotten in one decade becomes critical in another. Technology evolves. Old assumptions collapse. Tiny mistakes suddenly matter. A single fiber, a fingerprint once considered useless. A microscopic trace invisible to investigators 20 years earlier. Cold cases are patient. They wait, sometimes longer than anyone believes possible. Inside the evidence room, sealed boxes remained untouched for months at a time. Labels yellowed, tape dried, and cracked. But every item inside preserved a frozen moment from the winter of 2000. A receipt, photographs, interview transcripts, vehicle records, laboratory reports. Each one represented another attempt to answer the same impossible question. What happened that night? Detectives often described one feeling that never disappeared. Something about the case felt incomplete. Not impossible. Incomplete. As though one missing piece sat just beyond reach. One retired investigator admitted years later that he occasionally woke before dawn convinced he had finally solved it in a dream. By breakfast, the details were gone. Only frustration remained. The town continued moving forward because life demanded it. New families arrived. Businesses opened. Children graduated. Roads were widened. Buildings changed. But beneath every improvement rested an invisible history that no renovation could erase. Visitors saw a peaceful Minnesota community. Residents saw intersections where search teams once gathered. Fields where helicopters landed. Church halls where volunteers waited for news that never came. Every place carried memories invisible to outsiders. Then, nearly 2 decades after the disappearance, something happened that no one expected. A routine review of preserved evidence produced a result that investigators in 2000 could never have imagined. Not a confession, not a forgotten witness. Something much smaller. Something almost invisible. And yet powerful enough to make experienced detectives stare at each other in complete silence as a decades-old mystery threatened, for the first time, to move. The discovery did not arrive with flashing police lights or a dramatic confession. There was no suspect waiting outside a courtroom, no moment where the truth suddenly stepped into the sunlight. It arrived quietly, inside a laboratory, a place where thousands of forgotten details waited for another chance. For nearly 2 decades, the Minnesota cold case had remained frozen in time. The original investigators had followed every lead available to them. They had interviewed everyone connected to the victim. They had searched the places where she had last been seen. They had chased rumors, examined theories, and spent countless hours trying to rebuild a night that seemed determined to stay hidden. But the case had always been missing one thing: a connection, something that could link a person to the crime. Something that could transform suspicion into evidence. Now, years later, investigators believe they might finally have found it. The evidence collected back in 2000 had survived. Stored away, cataloged, protected, waiting. And when modern forensic technology was applied to those old pieces of the past, the case suddenly looked different. The same evidence that once appeared meaningless began telling a new story. Tiny traces that had been invisible before were no longer silent. A small sample, a partial result, a scientific possibility. It was enough to reopen questions that many believed had already been answered. Investigators returned to the original case file. The photographs, the interviews, the timelines, the handwritten notes from detectives who had long since retired. Every detail was examined again. And this time, they were not looking for what happened. They were looking for what everyone had missed. Cold cases often break open because the smallest details survive the longest. A conversation someone forgot. A vehicle someone ignored. A name buried inside thousands of pages of paperwork. A person who seemed unimportant decades earlier suddenly becomes impossible to ignore. That was exactly what happened in Minnesota. A name that had appeared before began to stand out. Someone connected to the investigation. Someone who had been questioned years earlier. Someone who had remained just close enough to the story to avoid disappearing completely. At first, detectives did not announce anything. They knew better. Cold case investigations are fragile. A single mistake can destroy years of progress. A careless statement can alert the wrong person. So investigators worked quietly. They began rebuilding the timeline again. Where was everyone on the night she disappeared? Who had access to the area? Who knew her routine? Who had information they never shared? The questions from 2000 returned. But the answers were being searched for in a different world. A world with advanced databases, improved DNA analysis, digital records, technology that did not exist when the case first shocked the community. The investigation moved beyond Minnesota. Records were checked across state lines. Old relationships were examined. Previous statements were compared. Investigators looked for contradictions. Small inconsistencies that once seemed harmless suddenly became important. Because memories fade, but evidence remembers. The suspect, according to investigators, had lived a remarkably ordinary life after the disappearance. That detail stunned people who had followed the case for years. There was no dramatic escape, no obvious signs, no public behavior that screamed guilt. Just a person moving through life while an entire community carried an unanswered question. This is what makes cold cases so disturbing. Sometimes the person responsible is not hiding in the shadows. Sometimes they are simply living, working, shopping, driving familiar roads, passing people who have no idea what they may know. For years, the community wondered if the person responsible had left Minnesota. Many believed the answer was somewhere far away. Another state, another city, another identity. But investigators were beginning to consider another possibility. The truth had never left. It had been nearby all along. When detectives began contacting witnesses again, some were shocked to hear from police after so many years. Many believed the case had been forgotten. One former investigator said that was the biggest misconception about cold cases. They are never truly closed. They may become quiet. They may disappear from headlines. But somewhere, someone still has the file. Someone still has the evidence. Someone still wants an answer. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered details that changed how they viewed the night of the disappearance. The victim's final hours were reconstructed with greater accuracy. The timeline became sharper. The gaps became smaller. The unknown moments became fewer. And one moment stood out. A brief window of time. A period where investigators believed the victim crossed paths with someone who would change the course of multiple lives forever. The community reacted when rumors began spreading that the case was moving again. People who had spent years accepting uncertainty suddenly began asking questions. Could this really be happening? Could a mystery that had lasted nearly 20 years finally have an ending? For the victim's family, hope returned carefully. They had experienced disappointment before. They had heard promises. They had watched investigations restart and fade away. They knew better than anyone that a new lead did not guarantee justice. But this time felt different, because investigators were not chasing a theory. They were following evidence, and evidence had a way of changing everything. The person investigators were focusing on had no idea that the past was catching up. At least, that was what detectives believed. For years, time had been the strongest protection. The longer a case remained unsolved, the harder it became to prove. Witnesses moved. Memories changed. People assumed the truth would disappear forever. But time also creates unexpected opportunities. People leave records. Technology improves. Old evidence gains new meaning. The very years that seemed to bury the case had also preserved the answers. Then came the moment investigators had been waiting for. A breakthrough. A result that confirmed what they had suspected. The evidence was enough to move forward. Enough to take the next step. Enough to transform a forgotten investigation into an active criminal case once again. Behind closed doors, officials prepared. Legal documents were reviewed. Plans were made. Every detail had to be correct. Because after waiting nearly 20 years, there would only be one chance to get it right. The arrest had to happen carefully, quietly, precisely. Meanwhile, the community remained unaware of how close they were to the moment that would change everything. People continued driving past the same streets, walking through the same neighborhoods, living beside a mystery that had haunted them for decades. They did not know that the answer they had waited for was no longer buried in the past. It was approaching, slowly, patiently, and when authorities finally moved, the entire state would be forced to confront a shocking reality. The cold case that everyone thought might never be solved was about to make headlines again. Not because of another disappearance, not because of another unanswered question, but because after all those years, someone was finally going to be held responsible. The morning of the arrest began like any other. The sun rose over Minnesota. Cars moved along familiar roads. People started their daily routines. Most had no idea that somewhere nearby, investigators were preparing to close a chapter that had remained open for far too long. A chapter written in grief. A chapter written in uncertainty. A chapter that had waited almost 20 years for its final pages. The moment investigators had been waiting for arrived without warning. There were no cameras positioned outside the home. No reporters gathered behind police tape. No public announcement prepared the community for what was about to happen. Just a quiet operation built on years of patience. After nearly 2 decades of unanswered questions, the Minnesota cold case was no longer a mystery locked inside an evidence room. It was moving. Early that morning, investigators reviewed the final details one more time. Every document, every piece of evidence, every statement collected over the years. They knew the importance of what was about to happen. This was not just an arrest. It was the moment a family had waited for. The moment a community that had lived with uncertainty for years would finally hear a name connected to the tragedy that had haunted them. But even after all the progress, detectives understood something important. An arrest does not erase the pain. It does not return lost years. It does not undo the questions that families carry every single day. It only begins the final search for the truth. As authorities approached the location, the suspect had no idea the past was arriving at the front door. For years, life had continued. The person investigators believed was responsible had built a normal existence. A routine, a reputation, relationships, a life that appeared separate from the disappearance that had dominated headlines decades earlier. That was what shocked people the most. The idea that someone connected to such a devastating crime could remain unnoticed for so long. Neighbors later described the feeling that spread through the community after news of the arrest became public. Disbelief, shock, confusion. Many struggled to understand how the person they were now hearing about could have remained part of everyday life for so many years. The phrase appeared everywhere. Cold case solved. After years of silence, the case was finally moving forward. But behind the headline was a story far more complicated than a simple arrest. Because the investigation had not started with one dramatic clue. It had started with persistence, with detectives who refused to forget, with evidence that survived, with a family that continued asking questions even when answers seemed impossible. The arrest immediately reopened memories from the winter of 2000. People remembered the fear, the searches, the posters, the conversations that filled the town. They remembered how quickly a peaceful community changed after someone vanished. The disappearance had created a wound that never fully closed. Every anniversary brought back the same emotions. Every unanswered question reopened the same pain. For the victims' loved ones, time had been both their enemy and their only hope. Years took away moments they could never recover. But years also allowed science to catch up, allowed investigators another chance, allowed the truth to survive. As the suspect entered the legal system, investigators began revealing more about what had led them there. The breakthrough was not one single piece of evidence. It was the combination of everything, a modern examination of old material, a deeper review of previous interviews, A timeline reconstructed with information unavailable during the original investigation. The past had been re-examined through the lens of the present, and what once appeared unclear began forming a pattern. The investigation showed how difficult cold cases truly are. They are not solved because someone suddenly remembers everything. They are solved because someone refuses to stop searching. Years earlier, detectives had faced enormous challenges. Technology was limited. Information systems were different. Forensic methods were not as advanced. A clue that seemed useless in 2000 might become powerful decades later. That is the strange reality of old cases. Evidence does not become older. Sometimes it becomes more valuable. The arrest also changed how people viewed the original investigation. Some questioned why it took so long. Others defended the investigators who had worked through impossible circumstances. The truth was complicated. A cold case is not a single investigation. It is many investigations separated by time. Different detectives, different technology, different possibilities. Every new investigator inherits not only evidence, but also the weight of everything that came before. The mistakes, the unanswered questions, the missed opportunities, the hope, and the responsibility to find what others could not. As the news spread, former witnesses began revisiting their own memories. People who had spoken with investigators years earlier wondered whether they had unknowingly been closer to the truth than they realized. A conversation from 2 decades before suddenly felt different. A forgotten detail suddenly seemed important. A familiar face from the past appeared in a new light. That is the haunting power of a cold case. The past is never completely gone. It waits, sometimes for years, sometimes for generations. The community that once searched for answers now faced a different challenge. Accepting them, because solving a mystery does not always bring immediate peace. Sometimes the truth creates new pain. Families must hear details they spent years imagining. Communities must confront realities they hoped were impossible. And everyone must understand that justice often arrives much later than anyone wants. The suspect's first court appearance drew attention from across Minnesota. People who had followed the case for years watched closely. Some wanted answers. Some wanted accountability. Some simply wanted to see the justice system acknowledge what their community had endured. The courtroom became another stage in a story that had already lasted far too long. But even with an arrest, one question remained at the center of everything. Why? Why did it happen? Why did the victim never return home? Why did someone allow a family to suffer through decades of uncertainty? Those questions were heavier than any legal document, heavier than any headline. Because behind every cold case is a human story. A person who was loved, a life interrupted, a family forced to continue without answers. The victim was no longer just a photograph from an old news report. She was a daughter, a friend, a coworker, a person with dreams, plans, and a future that disappeared in a single night. As investigators continued preparing the case for trial, they also began looking back at the original timeline. The final hours, the last confirmed sightings, the moments that had always remained unclear. And with the suspect now identified, those moments took on new meaning. Old questions demanded new answers. The road where the vehicle was discovered, the locations searched by volunteers, the witnesses who remembered something unusual. Every piece of the story was being placed back onto the table. For years, the disappearance had been a mystery. Now it was becoming a case that would reveal whether investigators had finally uncovered the truth or whether another layer of mystery still remained hidden. Because even after an arrest, even after headlines announce a breakthrough, cold cases have a way of keeping secrets. And in Minnesota, after nearly 20 years of silence, the most important questions were finally beginning to surface. For nearly 20 years, the disappearance had existed as a question with no answer, a name without a conclusion, a photograph attached to a story that seemed destined to remain unfinished. But now, with an arrest made and a suspect finally identified, investigators began reopening the moments that had haunted them since the winter of 2000. Every second mattered, every decision, every location, Every person who crossed paths with the victim before she vanished. Because the truth of a cold case is rarely hidden in one dramatic moment. It is buried inside thousands of ordinary details. A phone call, a conversation, a routine stop, a person who was there but never considered important. And now detectives were determined to find the detail that had been waiting all along. The original investigation had started with urgency. A missing person report, a worried family, a community desperate for answers. But as the days passed without finding the victim, the case changed. It was no longer simply a search. It became a race against time. Investigators knew the first hours after a disappearance were critical. Those hours can reveal movement, intent, opportunity. But in 2000, the case moved forward with limited information. There were no clear surveillance images, no digital footprint tracking every movement, no instant access to massive databases. Detectives had only what they could collect by hand: interviews, paper records, physical evidence, human memory. And human memory can be unreliable, especially after years pass. A witness may remember a face but forget a date, a sound but not a location, a feeling but not the exact reason behind it. That uncertainty became one of the greatest challenges in the investigation. Still, detectives continued. They interviewed everyone connected to the victim. Friends described someone who was dependable and responsible, someone who maintained routines, someone who did not simply disappear without explanation. Family members provided details about her plans, her relationships, and her daily life. Nothing pointed toward a voluntary disappearance. Nothing suggested she wanted to leave everything behind. The evidence showed something much more disturbing. Someone else had interrupted her life. But proving who that person was became the impossible task. Years earlier, investigators had considered multiple possibilities. A stranger passing through town, someone known to the victim, a person motivated by anger, a person motivated by obsession. Each theory led detectives down different paths. Some paths ended quickly. Others consumed months. One theory focused on the mysterious vehicle reported near the area where the victim was last believed to have been. The description was incomplete. The witness had seen it briefly. Snow and darkness made details difficult. But the possibility remained. Who was inside that vehicle? Was the driver connected to the disappearance? Or was it simply another coincidence in a case full of unanswered questions? For years, that question remained open. And unanswered questions create their own kind of damage. They become part of everyday life. A family hears a song and remembers someone who should still be there. A street becomes more than a street. A date becomes more than a date. The disappearance becomes something that follows them everywhere. The community also carried the weight. People who had volunteered during the searches remembered walking through freezing conditions, calling the victim's name into empty fields. They remembered believing that one more search might change everything. One more conversation. One more piece of information. One more chance. But each day without answers made hope harder to maintain. Then came the years of silence. The headlines disappeared. The public moved on. New crimes filled the news. New tragedies replaced old ones. But inside the investigation files, the case remained alive. Detectives changed. Leadership changed. The world changed. But the question remained exactly the same. What happened? The breakthrough decades later came because investigators looked at the case differently. They were no longer limited by the assumptions of 2000. They examined old evidence with new technology. They questioned previous conclusions. They challenged details that had once been accepted. And slowly, a different picture began to emerge. The person investigators focused on was not someone randomly connected to the story. There was a relationship, a connection that had always existed but had never been fully understood. This changed everything, because crimes involving strangers are often difficult to solve. But crimes involving people who know each other leave different traces, different patterns, different questions. Investigators began analyzing the suspect's history. Where had the person been? What had been said? What had changed after the disappearance? Were there unusual behaviors? Were there statements that seemed harmless at the time, but now carried a different meaning? The answers created a timeline, and the timeline created pressure. The suspect had spent years believing the past was behind them. But investigators were no longer looking at the past. They were bringing the past into the present. That was the power of the cold case breakthrough. Time had not erased the evidence. It had preserved it. The same winter that buried the investigation had also preserved the pieces needed to rebuild it. When news of the investigation reached people who had followed the case from the beginning, reactions were emotional. Some were relieved. Some were angry. Some struggled to believe that the mystery that had shaped their community for so long might finally have an ending. For the victim's family, the announcement carried complicated emotions. Justice was closer, but nothing could restore what had been lost. No arrest could bring back birthdays. No trial could replace memories. No verdict could erase years of waiting. The investigation continued toward the next stage. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence. Law enforcement prepared additional statements. Experts examined forensic findings. Every detail needed to survive courtroom challenges. Because solving a cold case is only the first battle. Proving it beyond a reasonable doubt is another. And as the legal process began, the public wanted to know more. Who was this person? How did they avoid suspicion for so long? What happened on that final night? What secret had remained hidden for nearly 20 years? The answers were coming, but investigators knew they could not rush. The same patience that solved the case would now be needed to tell the full story. Because the disappearance of one person had created decades of questions. And every question led back to one night, one road, one moment, one decision that changed everything. As the case moved forward, more details from the original investigation began to surface. Details that had been overlooked. Details that had been misunderstood. Details that now appeared connected. The mystery was finally beginning to unravel. But with every answer came another question. And the deeper investigators went, the more they realized something terrifying. The truth had not been impossible to find. It had been hidden in plain sight. For years, the people of Minnesota lived with a mystery that refused to disappear. They knew the story. They knew the photograph. They knew the name. But they never knew the ending. The disappearance had become one of those cases people mentioned in quiet conversations. A tragedy frozen in time. A reminder that some questions can survive decades. A reminder that even when headlines fade, families never stop searching. Now, after the arrest, the investigation entered its most important phase. The search for answers became a search for proof. Because a cold case can be solved in the eyes of investigators long before it is proven in a courtroom. Evidence must be organized. Timelines must be rebuilt. Every claim must be supported. Every piece of the story must fit together. And that meant returning once again to the beginning. The final day, the final hours, the final known moments before everything changed. Investigators reconstructed the victim's movements with the precision of people trying to recover a lost memory. They studied where she had been, who she had spoken with, what she had done. Every ordinary action suddenly carried importance. The last meal, the last conversation, the last confirmed sighting. Because the most terrifying moments in true crime are often not dramatic. They are normal. A person leaves work. A person drives home. A person makes plans for tomorrow. And then, without warning, tomorrow never arrives. That was the reality that haunted this Minnesota community. The victim had not vanished from a dangerous place. She had disappeared from an ordinary life. That was what made the case so frightening. There was no obvious warning. No clear sign that danger was approaching. The night began like thousands of other nights across the state. Cold, quiet, routine, until it wasn't. As detectives examined the evidence again, they focused heavily on the timeline. Time is one of the most powerful weapons in an investigation. A few minutes can eliminate a suspect. A few minutes can create one. A person's location during a specific window can change everything. And after years of reviewing the case, investigators believed they had found inconsistencies. Small details that did not match. Statements that required another look. Moments where the official story and the evidence did not align. These were the cracks that allowed the truth to slowly emerge. The suspect had spoken before, years earlier, during the original investigation. At that time, investigators did not have enough information to move forward. There was no complete picture, no final connection, no evidence strong enough to prove involvement. But decades later, detectives were looking at those same conversations differently. Words that once seemed ordinary began to sound unusual. Explanations that once appeared reasonable began raising questions. Because context changes everything. A sentence spoken in 2000 might mean something very different when examined after years of investigation. The breakthrough also highlighted one of the strangest realities of cold cases. Sometimes the person investigators are searching for has already been interviewed, already documented, already somewhere inside the case file. The challenge is recognizing what matters. The challenge is knowing which detail was overlooked. The arrest shocked the community because many people had expected the answer to come from somewhere far away. A stranger, a criminal passing through, someone unknown. But instead, investigators revealed a connection closer than many imagined. The person at the center of the case was not a distant figure from another state, not a mystery hidden behind a false identity. Someone connected to the story, someone whose name had existed around the investigation for years. That realization changed how people viewed the past. Neighbors began replaying old memories. Conversations from years before suddenly returned. People wondered if they had unknowingly been standing near the answer all along. This is the emotional power of a cold case breakthrough. It does not only change the future, it changes the way people remember the past. Every location becomes significant. Every interaction becomes something to reconsider. Every unanswered question finally has the possibility of an answer. But the investigation was far from simple. Prosecutors needed to build a case strong enough to survive intense scrutiny. Defense attorneys would challenge every piece of evidence, every timeline, every witness, every conclusion. That meant investigators had to be precise. They had waited too long to make mistakes. Behind the scenes, forensic experts continued analyzing evidence collected decades earlier. Materials preserved since the original investigation were reviewed with modern techniques. The smallest traces became powerful. Science had changed. The tools had changed. The possibilities had changed. And evidence that once sat quietly inside storage boxes now had a voice. That voice was finally telling investigators what they had been unable to hear in 2000. The community watched as more information became public. People who had followed the case for years gathered around televisions and computer screens. The story that once represented frustration and loss had become a story of unexpected movement. A cold case solved, a suspect arrested, a family finally approaching justice. But beneath the headlines was a painful truth. The victims' loved ones had waited through years that could never be returned. They had lived through anniversaries without answers, holidays without closure, moments when they had to explain the impossible absence of someone they loved. For them, the arrest was not a celebration. It was a moment filled with complicated emotions. Relief, anger, sadness, a reminder of everything lost. Investigators understood that solving the case was not just about identifying a suspect. It was about restoring a piece of the victim's story. For years, the disappearance had defined everything. The missing person, the unanswered question, the mystery. Now, investigators wanted the world to remember something else. The person who existed before the tragedy. The life that came before the headlines. The relationships. The memories. The moments that mattered. Because every cold case begins with a person, not a file number, not an investigation, not a headline. A person. And every cold case leaves behind people who continue living with the consequences. As the legal process moved forward, investigators continued examining the final pieces of the puzzle. They looked deeper into the suspect's actions after the disappearance. What happened in the days afterward? The weeks afterward? The years afterward? Sometimes the strongest evidence in a case is not found at the beginning. It is found in what happens after, how someone reacts, what they say, what they avoid, what they remember. And investigators believe those years after the disappearance contained important answers. Because while the community was searching for the truth, someone else may have been carrying it. For nearly 20 years, silence protected the secret. But silence does not last forever. Eventually, evidence speaks. Eventually, questions return. Eventually, the past finds a way to reach the present. And in Minnesota, after decades of waiting, that moment had finally arrived. The cold case that once seemed impossible to solve was no longer just a mystery. It was becoming a story of justice. But before the final chapter could be written, investigators still had to uncover every hidden detail. Because the arrest had answered one question. But the most important question remained. What truly happened on that cold night in 2000? For years, the people of Minnesota lived with a mystery that refused to disappear. They knew the story. They knew the photograph. They knew the name. But they never knew the ending. The disappearance had become one of those cases people mentioned in quiet conversations, a tragedy frozen in time, a reminder that some questions can survive decades, a reminder that even when headlines fade, families never stop searching. Now, after the arrest, the investigation entered its most important phase. The search for answers became a search for proof. Because a cold case can be solved in the eyes of investigators long before it is proven in a courtroom. Evidence must be organized. Timelines must be rebuilt. Every claim must be supported. Every piece of the story must fit together. And that meant returning once again to the beginning. The final day, the final hours, the final known moments before everything changed. Investigators reconstructed the victim's movements with the precision of people trying to recover a lost memory. They studied where she had been, who she had spoken with, what she had done. Every ordinary action suddenly carried importance. The last meal, the last conversation, the last confirmed sighting. Because the most terrifying moments in true crime are often not dramatic. They are normal. A person leaves work. A person drives home. A person makes plans for tomorrow. And then, without warning, tomorrow never arrives. That was the reality that haunted this Minnesota community. The victim had not vanished from a dangerous place. She had disappeared from an ordinary life. That was what made the case so frightening. There was no obvious warning. No clear sign that danger was approaching. The night began like thousands of other nights across the state. Cold, quiet, routine. Until it wasn't. As detectives examined the evidence again, they focused heavily on the timeline. Time is one of the most powerful weapons in an investigation. A few minutes can eliminate a suspect. A few minutes can create one. A person's location during a specific window can change everything. And after years of reviewing the case, investigators believed they had found inconsistencies. Small details that did not match. Statements that required another look. Moments where the official story and the evidence did not align. These were the cracks that allowed the truth to slowly emerge. The suspect had spoken before, years earlier, during the original investigation. At that time, investigators did not have enough information to move forward. There was no complete picture, no final connection, no evidence strong enough to prove involvement. But decades later, detectives were looking at those same conversations differently. Words that once seemed ordinary began to sound unusual. Explanations that once appeared reasonable began raising questions. Because context changes everything. A sentence spoken in 2000 might mean something very different when examined after years of investigation. The breakthrough also highlighted one of the strangest realities of cold cases. Sometimes the person investigators are searching for has already been interviewed, already documented, already somewhere inside the case file. The challenge is recognizing what matters. The challenge is knowing which detail was overlooked. The arrest shocked the community because many people had expected the answer to come from somewhere far away. A stranger, a criminal passing through, someone unknown. But instead, investigators revealed a connection closer than many imagined. The person at the center of the case was not a distant figure from another state. Not a mystery hidden behind a false identity. Someone connected to the story. Someone whose name had existed around the investigation for years. That realization changed how people viewed the past. Neighbors began replaying old memories. Conversations from years before suddenly returned. People wondered if they had unknowingly been standing near the answer all along. This is the emotional power of a cold case breakthrough. It does not only change the future, it changes the way people remember the past. Every location becomes significant. Every interaction becomes something to reconsider. Every unanswered question finally has the possibility of an answer. But the investigation was far from simple. Prosecutors needed to build a case strong enough to survive intense scrutiny. Defense attorneys would challenge every piece of evidence, every timeline, every witness, every conclusion. That meant investigators had to be precise. They had waited too long to make mistakes. Behind the scenes, forensic experts continued analyzing evidence collected decades earlier. Materials preserved since the original investigation were reviewed with modern techniques. The smallest traces became powerful. Science had changed. The tools had changed. The possibilities had changed. And evidence that once sat quietly inside storage boxes now had a voice. That voice was finally telling investigators what they had been unable to hear in 2000. The community watched as more information became public. People who had followed the case for years gathered around televisions and computer screens. The story that once represented frustration and loss had become a story of unexpected movement. A cold case solved, a suspect arrested, a family finally approaching justice. But beneath the headlines was a painful truth. The victims' loved ones had waited through years that could never be returned. They had lived through anniversaries without answers, holidays without closure, moments when they had to explain the impossible absence of someone they loved. For them, the arrest was not a celebration. It was a moment filled with complicated emotions. Relief, anger, sadness, a reminder of everything lost. Investigators understood that solving the case was not just about identifying a suspect. It was about restoring a piece of the victim's story. For years, the disappearance had defined everything. The missing person, the unanswered question, the mystery. Now, investigators wanted the world to remember something else. The person who existed before the tragedy. The life that came before the headlines. The relationships. The memories. The moments that mattered. Because every cold case begins with a person. Not a file number. Not an investigation. Not a headline. A person. And every cold case leaves behind people who continue living with the consequences. As the legal process moved forward, investigators continued examining the final pieces of the puzzle. They looked deeper into the suspect's actions after the disappearance. What happened in the days afterward, the weeks afterward, the years afterward? Sometimes the strongest evidence in a case is not found at the beginning. It is found in what happens after. How someone reacts, what they say, what they avoid, what they remember. And investigators believed those years after the disappearance contained important answers. Because while the community was searching for the truth, someone else may have been carrying it. For nearly 20 years, silence protected the secret. But silence does not last forever. Eventually, evidence speaks. Eventually, questions return. Eventually, the past finds a way to reach the present. And in Minnesota, after decades of waiting, that moment had finally arrived. The cold case that once seemed impossible to solve was no longer just a mystery. It was becoming a story of justice. But before the final chapter could be written, investigators still had to uncover every hidden detail. Because the arrest had answered one question. But the most important question remained. What truly happened on that cold night in 2000? The question remained the same after all those years. What truly happened on that cold night in 2000? The arrest had changed everything. But an arrest was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of the final search for the truth. For investigators, the case was no longer about wondering who might be responsible. Now, they had to prove what happened. They had to reconstruct a night that had been buried beneath decades of silence. A night where every missing detail mattered. The investigation turned toward the hours before the disappearance. The final movements, the final decisions, the final opportunities for someone to intervene, because every cold case has a timeline, a sequence of events that exists like a hidden map. And somewhere on that map is the moment where everything changes. For nearly 20 years, that moment had been impossible to find. Now, detectives believed they were closer than ever. The original case file contained hundreds of pages, reports written by investigators who had spent months chasing answers, statements from witnesses who remembered fragments, maps of locations searched, photographs of places that had become permanently connected to the tragedy. Reading through the file was like opening a time capsule. Every page carried the frustration of people who wanted answers but did not have enough information to reach them. The detectives working the case decades later understood the responsibility they carried. They were not just investigating a crime. They were finishing work that had begun long before them. They studied the original assumptions. They examined what investigators believed in 2000. And then they asked the most important question: what if they were wrong? That question is often where cold cases begin to move. Not because previous investigators failed, but because time changes what is possible. New technology, new information, new perspectives. A different detective looking at the same evidence can sometimes see what others could not. In this case, the breakthrough came from connecting pieces that had always existed. The evidence was not created overnight. The answers were not magically discovered. They were built from years of persistence. One piece, then another, until the picture became impossible to ignore. Investigators focused on the relationship between the victim and the person now accused. They examined interactions that had once seemed ordinary. They looked at opportunities, access, knowledge, timing. They asked questions that had not been asked before. Who knew where she would be? Who understood her routine? Who could have approached her without causing immediate alarm? These questions changed the direction of the investigation, because the case was no longer about a random disappearance. It was about a specific connection, a specific possibility, a person who may have been closer to the final moments than anyone realized. As more details emerged, the community reacted with disbelief. People remembered the fear that followed the disappearance, the uncertainty, the endless speculation. Now, they were forced to look back through a different lens. The person responsible had not been some unknown figure hiding in the distance. The answer had been much closer. That realization created a new wave of emotion. For some, it brought relief. For others, anger. For many, it created a painful question. How could something so devastating happen while life continued normally around it? That is the haunting reality of many cold cases. The tragedy happens in one moment, but the consequences continue for decades. Families grow older while waiting. Communities move forward while remembering. And somewhere inside the silence, the truth remains. As prosecutors prepared their case, investigators carefully reviewed every piece of evidence. They knew public attention could not replace legal certainty. A headline could say "cold case solved," but a courtroom required more. It required facts. It required proof. It required a story supported by evidence. The prosecution's challenge was to transform a decades-old mystery into a clear explanation. They needed to show what happened, how it happened, and why the accused person was responsible. That meant examining every detail connected to the suspect's actions after the disappearance. The days afterward became especially important. Investigators studied behavior, statements, movements, changes that might reveal hidden information. Because sometimes the truth appears not in what someone does during a crime, but in what they do afterward. The suspect had spent years living with the knowledge of what investigators now believed happened. And detectives wanted to understand how that secret survived, how someone could continue forward while a family searched, while volunteers walked through forests, while the community waited. The emotional weight of the case became impossible to ignore. People who had participated in the original search spoke publicly about those early days. They remembered the determination, the belief that the victim would be found. They remembered searching places they never imagined they would have to search. Empty fields, remote roads, frozen landscapes. They remembered calling out a name into the cold air and hearing only silence in return. Those memories returned with new meaning after the arrest, because for years they had wondered whether they had been close, whether the answer had been somewhere nearby, whether one more search could have changed everything. Now, investigators were providing a different kind of answer. The truth had not been found by giving up. It had been found by continuing. The advancement of forensic science played a major role in changing the direction of the case. Technology that did not exist in 2000 allowed investigators to revisit evidence with new precision. Old materials became new opportunities. Items that had once been considered insignificant were examined again. Every trace mattered. Every possibility was considered. The case became an example of how time can work in unexpected ways. For criminals, time may feel like protection, but for investigators, time can become a tool. Because evidence can wait, and technology can catch up. The arrest also raised another question across Minnesota. Could there be other cases connected to the suspect? When someone is finally identified after years of silence, investigators often examine their history, past locations, past relationships, past events that once seemed unrelated. They look for patterns. They look for answers. They look for anything that might explain whether this was an isolated tragedy or part of something larger. Those investigations happen quietly, carefully, without assumptions, because every additional question must be supported by facts. Meanwhile, the victim's family continued waiting for the one thing they had wanted most: the complete truth. Not rumors, not theories, not possibilities. The truth. They had spent years living with uncertainty. Now they were finally approaching the moment when they could hear what happened. But sometimes the truth is painful. Sometimes answers create new wounds. Because knowing what happened does not change what was lost. The person who disappeared would not return. The years would not come back. The empty chair at family gatherings would remain a reminder. Justice could arrive, but time could not be reversed. As the case moved closer toward trial, investigators prepared for the next battle. The courtroom, a place where every detail would be examined, every claim challenged, every memory questioned. The story that had lived through headlines and whispers would now face the strictest test of all: evidence. For nearly 2 decades, the cold case had been defined by absence. A missing person, a missing answer, a missing conclusion. Now, for the first time, the case was defined by something else. A possibility, a path forward, a chance to finally understand the night that changed everything. But as investigators continued uncovering the details, they discovered that the story was even more complicated than anyone expected. Because behind the arrest was a chain of events stretching back years. A series of decisions, a series of moments, and one hidden truth that had remained buried for far too long. For decades, the people of Minnesota wondered if they would ever hear the full story. They had lived with fragments: a missing person report, a vehicle discovered in the cold, a photograph repeated in old news articles, a family searching for answers, a community waiting for a phone call that never came. But now, the silence surrounding the case was beginning to break. The investigation had moved from suspicion to evidence, from questions to accusations, from a mystery buried in the past to a courtroom battle waiting to happen. And as investigators prepared the case, they began revealing the hidden timeline that had remained unclear for so many years. The timeline began with something ordinary: a normal day, a routine that gave no warning of what was coming. That detail remained one of the most disturbing parts of the case. The victim was not someone running from danger. She was not disappearing from a chaotic life. She was living the same kind of day that millions of people experience: work, responsibilities, plans, small conversations, simple moments. Then, somewhere between those ordinary moments, something changed. Something happened that would create a mystery lasting nearly 20 years. Investigators believed the key to understanding the case was hidden inside that transition. The moment when normal life became something else. The moment when the victim crossed paths with someone who would forever alter the future. For years, detectives searched for that moment. They searched through interviews. They searched through records. They searched through memories that became less reliable with every passing year. But now, with new evidence and a new perspective, the timeline began coming together. The person investigators identified had not appeared suddenly. They had been part of the story from the beginning. That realization shocked many people who followed the case. Because the most frightening mysteries are not always created by strangers. Sometimes they come from someone nearby, someone familiar, someone who blends into everyday life. The investigation revealed how easily a person can disappear into a community, how someone can attend meetings, speak with neighbors, and continue living while carrying a secret. That possibility disturbed many residents, because the case was no longer about a stranger hiding somewhere beyond the town. It was about someone who had existed within the same world as everyone else, someone who had watched the years pass. The suspect's life after the disappearance became a major focus. Investigators examined where the person went, who they spoke with, how their behavior changed, what they said when the case was still active. Every year after 2000 became another chapter to examine. Because time leaves traces. People change. Stories change. But patterns often remain. Detectives compared statements made years apart. They searched for contradictions, small differences that revealed larger questions. A forgotten detail, an altered explanation, a moment where the story did not fit. Those inconsistencies became important, not because one statement could solve a case, but because multiple small details can create a powerful picture. That is how many cold cases are solved. Not through one dramatic discovery, through hundreds of pieces finally connecting. The public often imagines investigations as moments of sudden revelation. A detective finding a hidden clue, a suspect confessing, a single piece of evidence changing everything. But real investigations are usually slower. They are built through patience, through comparison, through people refusing to stop asking questions. This Minnesota case followed that same path. Years of work created the foundation. Modern science provided new tools, and persistence created the opportunity for justice. As the case progressed, investigators also revisited the original searches. They looked again at locations that had been examined years earlier. Places where volunteers had walked. Places where detectives had looked. Places where everyone believed they had already searched everything. But technology had changed. Methods had changed. The ability to analyze old information had changed. A location that once provided no answers could now provide new possibilities. The investigation became a combination of past and present. The memories of 2000, the technology of today, the experience of detectives who understood both. For the victim's family, every new detail carried emotional weight. After years of uncertainty, they were finally learning more about the person responsible. But with each answer came the painful reality of what had been taken from them. The case was not just about solving a crime. It was about a life interrupted, a family forced to continue without someone they loved, a community forced to remember a tragedy that never received closure. The arrest gave people hope, but hope and healing are not the same thing. Healing takes time, especially when the wound has lasted decades. As the courtroom process approached, prosecutors prepared to present the story of the case. They would need to explain not only what happened, but why investigators believed the suspect was responsible. They would need to connect evidence from 2000 with discoveries made years later. They would need to show the jury the path from disappearance to arrest. That path was long, complicated, filled with uncertainty. But every step mattered, because behind the legal arguments was a human story. A person who vanished, a family who waited, a community that refused to forget. Meanwhile, public interest in the case grew again. News outlets revisited old reports. Former witnesses spoke about their memories. People who had once searched the streets of Minnesota watched the story return. The same questions that filled conversations in 2000 returned nearly 2 decades later. But now there was a difference. There was a name. There was a suspect. There was a possibility of an ending. For many, that was both comforting and unsettling. Because solving a cold case forces a community to confront something it has avoided for years. The reality that someone responsible may have been nearby all along. The reality that the mystery was not created by the absence of answers. It was created by the presence of a hidden truth. And hidden truths have a way of resurfacing. As investigators continued preparing the evidence, they discovered more about the connection between the suspect and the victim. Details that had been overlooked. Details that changed the way the entire case was understood. The relationship between them became one of the most important pieces of the puzzle. Because the question was no longer simply, who could have done this? It became, why? Why this victim? Why this moment? Why did someone choose to keep silent for so long? Those questions carried the emotional weight of the entire investigation. And as more information emerged, the community realized the case was not only about the night of the disappearance. It was about everything that came after. The years of silence, the years of waiting, the years when a family had no answers while someone else knew more than they revealed. That was the part that shocked people the most. Not just that the case had remained unsolved, but that the truth may have existed somewhere all along. Waiting, and patient. The arrest had opened the door. But behind that door was a story investigators still needed to fully uncover. A story of decisions made in seconds, consequences lasting decades, and a cold case that refused to stay buried. The cold case had survived nearly 2 decades of silence. It had survived changing investigators, changing technology, changing generations. But now, with the suspect identified and the evidence assembled, the investigation entered the most difficult stage. The search for the truth was no longer happening in empty fields or forgotten roads. It was happening inside courtrooms, inside evidence rooms, inside the memories of people who had carried the weight of the mystery for years. And as the case moved forward, investigators began revealing details that showed just how fragile the line was between an ordinary night and a life-changing tragedy. The disappearance began with a moment that seemed insignificant, a moment that nobody recognized as the final chapter of a normal life. That is what makes these cases so haunting. The victim did not know she was living her last hours of freedom. The people around her did not know they were witnessing moments they would remember forever. A simple goodbye, a routine conversation, a familiar road. All of it became part of a story that would continue long after everyone expected it to end. Investigators believe the answer had always been hidden inside those final moments. Not because the evidence was obvious, but because the truth was often surrounded by ordinary details. The victim's routine, the suspect's movements, the small choices made that night. Each detail became part of a larger picture. The challenge was separating coincidence from connection. For years, detectives had struggled with that question. What was important? What was just noise? Cold cases are filled with information. The difficulty is discovering which pieces matter. 1,000 details can exist inside an investigation. Only a few can change everything. The breakthrough came when investigators began examining those details together rather than separately. A single clue might not mean much, but several clues pointing in the same direction create a different story. The investigation had become a puzzle, and after years of searching, the pieces were finally beginning to fit. The suspect's connection to the victim became a central focus. Investigators examined their interactions, their history, their opportunities to encounter each other. They looked at what was known publicly and what had remained hidden. The picture that emerged was not a story of a random event. It was a story built around access and opportunity, around a person who may have known more than they ever admitted. The community reacted strongly as more information became available. Many residents who had lived through the original disappearance remembered the fear that followed. They remembered looking at every stranger differently. They remembered wondering if the person responsible was still nearby. Those fears had never completely disappeared. They had simply become part of daily life. Now, decades later, people were forced to confront those fears again. But this time there was a difference. The unknown had a name. The mystery had a direction. The investigation had momentum. For the victim's family, The developments brought a mixture of emotions that were impossible to describe with a single word. After so many years, they finally had answers. But answers could be painful. The truth could not return the person they lost. It could not restore the moments stolen from them. It could only explain what happened. And sometimes explanation is the beginning of healing, but it is also a reminder of everything that was taken away. As prosecutors prepared the case, they focused on building a timeline that could withstand every challenge. They knew the defense would question everything. Why did it take so long? Why was the suspect not arrested earlier? Why should anyone believe the evidence now? Those questions were expected. Cold cases always face skepticism. Time creates doubt. Memories become complicated. Evidence must survive decades of change. That is why every detail mattered. Investigators reviewed old reports line by line. They compared statements. They analyzed records. They studied evidence collected before many modern forensic methods existed. The past was being examined with tools from the future. And that combination changed the investigation. One of the most important aspects of the case was how technology transformed old evidence. Materials collected years earlier had not changed, but the ability to understand them had. Scientific advancement gave investigators another opportunity, a chance to ask old evidence new questions. The results created a path forward, a path that investigators believe connected the suspect to the disappearance. For years, the case had been defined by uncertainty. Now it was defined by evidence. That shift changed everything. The suspect, who had lived through years of silence, was suddenly facing the full force of an investigation that had never truly ended. The community watched as the story continued developing. The same case that once appeared on old newspaper pages was now appearing again on television screens and digital platforms. A new generation learned about the disappearance. Parents explained the story to children who had never known the fear of 2000. The cold case became a reminder that time does not always protect secrets. Sometimes time exposes them. Investigators also examined what happened after the disappearance. This part of the story was especially important because a crime does not end when the victim disappears. The aftermath can reveal just as much as the event itself. How did the suspect behave? What choices were made afterward? What was said? What was avoided? Those questions became part of the investigation. Detectives searched for patterns. They looked at whether actions after the disappearance matched the behavior of someone who knew more than they revealed. Every decision mattered. Every reaction became part of the story. The investigation was no longer only about a single night. It was about nearly 20 years of consequences. 20 years of a family waiting. 20 years of a community wondering. 20 years of someone living with the knowledge of what investigators believed had happened. That passage of time was one of the most shocking elements of the case. Because while the world moved forward, the mystery remained. A person could change jobs, move homes, build relationships, celebrate milestones, and still carry the weight of an unresolved crime. That possibility disturbed many people. It forced the community to reconsider how they understood the case. The person responsible was not necessarily hidden away. They may have been living an ordinary life. And that was the most unsettling thought of all. As the trial preparations continued, investigators focused on one final goal: creating a complete picture, not just a collection of evidence, not just a list of facts, a story that explained what happened, a story that honored the victim, a story that finally answered the questions that had remained unanswered for so long. The case had begun with a disappearance. It had continued with years of searching. It had survived decades of uncertainty. Now it was approaching the moment everyone had been waiting for, the moment when the truth would finally be tested. But before that could happen, investigators still had to confront the most difficult part of the case: the final unanswered details, the moments between what was known and what was still hidden, the space where mystery had lived for nearly 20 years. Even after evidence, even after a breakthrough, one question remained at the heart of everything: what really happened during those final moments before the victim disappeared forever? The question had followed investigators for years. It appeared in every report, every interview, Every conversation between detectives who refused to let the case disappear. What really happened during those final moments before the victim vanished? For nearly 20 years, that question had no answer. Only theories, only possibilities, only a painful silence that grew heavier with every passing year. But now, after the arrest, investigators believed they could finally reconstruct the chain of events that had remained hidden since the winter of 2000. The process was not simple. There was no single moment where every mystery suddenly disappeared. Instead, the truth emerged piece by piece. A detail from an old interview. A piece of evidence preserved for decades. A statement that had taken on new meaning. A connection that had been overlooked. Together, those pieces created a timeline that investigators believed explained how a normal evening became a tragedy that shocked an entire community. The victim's final known hours became the center of the investigation. Detectives examined every movement, every location, every person who had contact with her. They studied the ordinary moments that came before the extraordinary event. Because the most difficult part of solving a cold case is accepting that the answer is often hidden inside things that once seemed unimportant. A conversation that nobody remembered. A meeting that seemed harmless. A decision that appeared routine. Years later, those moments can become the foundation of an entire investigation. The suspect's actions during that time became increasingly important. Investigators examined what the person knew, what the person could have known, and what the person later claimed to know. Those differences mattered, because information is powerful. Someone who knows details they should not know can reveal more than they realize. Detectives began comparing early statements with later discoveries. They searched for changes, for explanations that evolved, for details that appeared only after investigators already knew certain information. Every inconsistency became another thread to examine. And slowly, the story began changing. The public had once imagined many possibilities. Some believed the victim had disappeared because of a stranger, someone passing through, someone with no connection to her life. But the investigation pointed in another direction. The person accused was someone connected to the victim's world, someone who understood enough about her routine to become part of the investigation. That realization created one of the strongest reactions from the community. Fear of strangers is easier to understand. Fear of someone familiar is much harder. Because familiarity creates trust. It lowers defenses. It makes danger harder to recognize. That was the reality investigators believed they were uncovering. The case was not about a random encounter. It was about a relationship, a connection, a moment where trust may have been violated. As the evidence continued to develop, investigators also focused on the years after the disappearance. The years when the victim's family searched for answers. The years when the community remembered. The years when the suspect continued living. Those years became an important part of the story. Because investigators believe behavior after a crime can reveal hidden information. Not always through dramatic actions. Sometimes through small choices. A comment. A reaction. A decision to avoid certain conversations. A pattern that only becomes visible when viewed over time. The suspect's life after 2000 was examined carefully. Where did they go? Who did they remain connected with? What changed after the disappearance? What stayed exactly the same? These questions were not about creating assumptions. They were about understanding the complete picture. A cold case cannot be solved by emotion alone. It requires evidence. It requires patience. It requires the ability to separate what people believe from what can be proven. That was the challenge facing investigators. They had waited years for this moment. They knew the public wanted answers. They knew the family deserved answers. But they also knew that the truth had to survive in court. The investigation continued behind closed doors. Evidence was organized. Experts prepared explanations. Legal teams studied every detail. The story that had lived through newspaper articles and community conversations was being transformed into a courtroom case. And every courtroom case depends on one thing: a connection between evidence and reality. The prosecution needed to show that the evidence did not simply suggest a possibility. It told a story with a beginning, a middle, and an ending. The beginning was the victim's final day. The middle was the disappearance and the years of uncertainty. The ending was the investigation that finally brought the case back into the public eye. But for the victim's family, the ending was not as simple as a headline. They had lived through the hardest part, the waiting, the not knowing, the endless questions. For years, they had imagined countless possibilities, some hopeful, some terrifying. Now, they were finally learning the truth. But truth after decades can feel complicated, because every answer carries another reminder. The person they loved was still gone. The years lost could not be returned. The memories could not be recreated. Justice could arrive late, but time could not move backward. The community also struggled with the reality of the arrest. Many residents remembered the early days of the case, the searches, the uncertainty, the fear. They remembered believing that someone responsible might never be found. Now, the impossible had happened. The cold case had moved. The mystery had a direction. The person accused would have to face the consequences. But the emotional impact remained, because some wounds do not disappear when answers arrive. They simply change. The case became a reminder of the importance of never forgetting victims. Behind every investigation is a human life. A person with memories, dreams, family, a future that was interrupted. As investigators prepared for trial, they continued examining every detail connected to the disappearance. They looked for anything that could strengthen the timeline, anything that could explain unanswered questions, anything that could provide the complete picture. Because solving a cold case is not just about finding a suspect. It is about understanding the truth. And the truth had to explain everything. Why did the victim disappear? Why did the suspect remain silent? Why did the case remain unsolved for so long? Those questions were still waiting, and investigators believed the answers were hidden inside the final pieces of evidence. The pieces that would determine whether the case truly reached its conclusion. The pieces that would reveal whether the arrest was the end of a decades-long nightmare, or only the beginning of another battle. As the courtroom date approached, attention returned to Minnesota. The story that began in 2000 was once again dominating conversations. A mystery that had survived nearly 20 years was about to face its final test. The evidence, the witnesses, the truth. And for the first time since the disappearance, the victim's story was no longer only about what was missing. It was about what had finally been found. The courtroom doors represented something the community had waited nearly 20 years to see. Accountability. After years of uncertainty, after years of unanswered questions, after years of wondering whether the truth would ever surface, the case had finally reached the place where every claim would be challenged and every piece of evidence would be examined. The mystery that began on a cold Minnesota night was no longer hidden inside old reports and forgotten files. It was now in front of a judge, in front of a jury, in front of the people who had followed the case from the beginning. But even as the trial approached, investigators knew one thing. The courtroom would not be about emotion. It would be about facts. Every detail collected over the years had to tell the same story. Every piece of evidence had to connect. Every witness had to explain what they knew. Because after decades of waiting, the truth could not depend on assumptions. It had to stand on proof. The prosecution began building its case around the timeline. The final hours before the disappearance. The movements of the victim. The actions of the accused. The evidence collected during the original investigation and the discoveries made decades later. The story was slowly reconstructed in front of the court. A story that had once existed only in the memories of a grieving family was now being presented through documents, testimony, and forensic findings. For the first time, many details that had remained private for years became public. The community listened carefully. Every new detail changed how people understood the case. Every piece of testimony brought them closer to the night that had haunted Minnesota for so long. The defense, however, challenged the investigation. They questioned the passage of time. They questioned memories. They questioned whether evidence collected years earlier could truly provide certainty. Those arguments were expected. Cold cases always carry the burden of time. The longer a case remains unsolved, the more difficult it becomes to prove. Witnesses move away. People forget details. Records disappear. Circumstances change. But investigators believe the same thing that had guided them from the beginning. Time had not destroyed the truth. It had preserved it. The evidence collected in 2000 had survived long enough for science to catch up. The methods that failed to provide answers decades earlier were no longer the same methods available today. Technology had transformed the investigation. The smallest traces became meaningful. The quietest details became powerful. A piece of evidence that once appeared insignificant could now tell a story. And that story was central to the prosecution. As the trial continued, witnesses who had lived with the memory of the disappearance returned to the spotlight. People who had searched. People who had spoken with investigators. People who remembered the fear that spread through the community. Their testimony carried the weight of time. They described the days when the victim's disappearance dominated everything. The posters, the searches, the hope, the heartbreak. They described a community that refused to believe someone could simply vanish without an answer. For many witnesses, returning to the case after so many years was emotional. They were not just discussing evidence. They were reopening memories. Memories of cold nights, empty roads, and a person who never came home. The victim's family also faced the unimaginable experience of hearing the story unfold in a courtroom. For years, they had lived with questions. Now they were hearing possible answers. But answers after decades can be painful, because every new detail brings them closer to understanding the loss. The courtroom became a place where grief and justice existed at the same time. A place where the past was examined while the future continued moving forward. The prosecution presented its argument with one central message. The disappearance was not random. The evidence showed a connection, a pattern, a sequence of events that led investigators to the person now on trial. They explained how years of work combined with modern technology changed the direction of the case. They showed how investigators returned to old evidence and discovered new meaning. They showed how a mystery that once seemed impossible began to unravel. But the defense continued challenging the government's timeline. They argued that suspicion was not the same as proof. They reminded the jury that decades had passed, that memories could change, that every piece of evidence needed careful examination. The courtroom became a battle between two versions of the past. One version built by investigators, one version presented by the defense. And the jury had to decide which story matched the evidence. Outside the courtroom, the community watched closely. For many residents, the case represented more than one crime. It represented every cold case that families fear will never be solved. It represented the hope that no victim is forgotten, that no investigation is truly over, that even after years of silence, answers can still emerge. The phrase that had once represented frustration now carried a different meaning. Cold case solved. A phrase that seemed impossible for years had become reality. But the emotional impact remained complicated. Because solving the case did not erase the years lost. It did not erase the questions that families had carried. It did not erase the pain of knowing that someone had taken away a future that could never be recovered. Justice has limits. It can punish. It can acknowledge wrongdoing. It can provide answers. But it cannot reverse time. As the trial moved closer to its conclusion, the evidence became the focus. The jury examined every detail, every statement, every connection. They had to determine whether the story presented by prosecutors was supported beyond a reasonable doubt. The decision would not only affect the accused, it would affect the victim's family, the community, and the legacy of the case itself. Because after nearly 20 years, everyone wanted the same thing: the truth. Not a theory, not a rumor, not another unanswered question. The truth. The final days of the trial carried a heavy atmosphere. Everyone understood the importance of the moment. A case that began with a disappearance was approaching a conclusion. A family that had waited through decades of uncertainty was approaching justice. A community that had carried a mystery for years was approaching closure. But before the final decision could be made, one final question remained. Had investigators truly uncovered the complete story, or were there still secrets hidden beneath the surface? Because even when a cold case reaches a courtroom, the past can still surprise everyone. And in Minnesota, after all those years, the final answer was about to arrive. The final days of the trial carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. For nearly 20 years, the disappearance had existed as an open wound. A family without answers. A community without certainty. An investigation trapped between hope and frustration. Now, everything came down to one decision, one verdict, one moment that would determine whether the decades of investigation had finally led to justice. Inside the courtroom, every piece of evidence had been examined. Every witness had been questioned. Every theory had been challenged. The jury had heard the story from both sides. They had heard about the night the victim vanished. They had heard about the investigation that followed. They had heard about the years of silence. And they had heard about the breakthrough that finally brought the case back into the spotlight. But a verdict is never based on emotion alone. It must be based on evidence. The jury carried a responsibility that was almost impossible to measure. They were not deciding only the future of the accused. They were deciding what the truth of the case would become. For the victim's family, the waiting continued. Even after the arrest. Even after the trial began. Even after hearing the evidence. There was still another moment they had to survive. The moment when the courtroom would announce whether the story finally had an ending. For years, they had imagined this day. But imagination could never prepare them for reality. Because justice after decades is complicated, it brings relief. But it also brings memories. It brings answers. But it also confirms painful truths. The victim would not return. The lost years would not return. The life interrupted in 2000 would remain interrupted forever.